Grandfather always forbade anyone from approaching the huge tree in the yard. After his death, his grandson decided to cut it down, and what he found under the roots shocked everyone. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. The Johnson property sat on the edge of a small southern town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's secrets, or at least thought they did. Life there moved slowly, like honey dripping from a jar, and the past lingered in the air with the weight of generations. On the back lot of the old wooden house, behind the sagging porch and the worn fence, there grew a massive oak tree that overshadowed everything around it. Its trunk was thick and scarred, its roots twisting across the ground like sleeping serpents. Its branches reached so high that when the afternoon sun leaned toward the west, the oak's shadow swallowed half the neighborhood. It was not just a tree. It was a presence, a monument, and for some, almost a warning. The house belonged to Elijah Johnson, a man whose dark skin had weathered both war and the hardships of life in the segregated South. He was known throughout the town for his stern face, deep voice, and the way he commanded respect without needing to raise his hand. Elijah was not cruel, but there was a gravity about him that kept people at a distance. Even in his later years, when his back bent and his hair turned silver, he still carried himself like a soldier who never left the battlefield. Children rarely dared to speak out of turn in his presence, and adults lowered their eyes when his gaze caught theirs. Yet, for all his sternness, there was something mysterious about him. Something no one quite understood. It centered on that oak tree. From as far back as anyone could remember, Elijah had never let anyone near it. Neighbors who came by with offers to prune it or trim its wild branches were dismissed sharply. His own children, when they were small, had been scolded harshly for playing too close to its roots. And when his grandchildren came along, curious as children always are, they quickly learned that the oak was off limits. No climbing, no touching, not even leaning against its trunk. It was as though the tree was sacred ground, though Elijah never called it holy. He never explained himself. Marcus, Elijah's grandson, remembered vividly a day when he was no older than 6. The summer heat had been stifling, and he had run out to the backyard to play while cicadas sang their shrill song from the branches above. The oak looked enormous to him, a castle waiting to be climbed. Without thinking, he had grasped the bark and tried to hoist himself upward. Before his small fingers could gain purchase, Elijah's voice thundered across the yard, "Get away from there!" Marcus froze. He turned to see his grandfather striding toward him, cane in one hand but fury in his eyes. Elijah pulled him back, not with a slap or a blow, but with such force in his grip that Marcus stumbled and nearly fell. The look in the old man's eyes was what remained carved in his memory, not just anger, but fear, raw and deep. Marcus had never seen his grandfather afraid of anything. That was the day he learned to keep away from the oak. The neighbors told stories, as neighbors do, trying to make sense of what they did not know. Some whispered that Elijah had buried treasure beneath the roots, perhaps stolen money from his days working the railroads. Others claimed it was darker, that something terrible had happened there, some crime committed long ago. Children at school dared each other to sneak into the Johnson yard at night and touch the tree, but few had the courage, and those who did never stayed long enough to brag about it. To them, the oak seemed haunted, and Elijah, the grim guardian who made sure whatever secret it held, stayed buried. For Elijah himself, the tree was an anchor. In the evenings, long after dinner had been cleared away and the house was quiet, he would take his chair outside and sit in the shadow of the oak. Sometimes he smoked his pipe, sometimes he simply sat, staring into the darkness, lips moving as though speaking to someone unseen. On rare occasions, Marcus, peeking through the window, heard fragments of words carried on the night breeze. They sounded like prayers or confessions, but never clear enough to understand. Once, when Marcus asked his grandmother what he was saying out there, she only shook her head. "Leave him be," she whispered. "That tree's his business, not yours." Elijah never shared the stories of his youth. He did not speak of his time in uniform, nor of the marches and protests that swept through towns like theirs in the 60s. If pressed, he would only grunt or fix the questioner with a glare that discouraged further curiosity. His medals remained tucked away in a drawer, his photographs hidden in boxes. Only the oak seemed to hold his attention year after year, as though it kept a piece of him no one else could reach. As the years wore on, Elijah grew older, his back more bent, his steps slower. Still, his vigilance over the tree never waned. One winter, when a storm toppled several smaller trees in the neighborhood, neighbors offered to help trim his oak before it became dangerous. He refused. "That tree stands as it is," he said firmly, his voice unshaken. Even then, when the winds howled and lightning split the sky, the oak held fast, defying nature's fury. People shook their heads and muttered that the tree was unnatural, but none dared confront Elijah about it again. Marcus, meanwhile, grew into a young man, carrying with him the memory of that day when his grandfather had pulled him away from the bark. The tree became a symbol of all the questions he had about Elijah's past, questions that remained unanswered. He loved his grandfather, respected him, but he could never shake the sense that beneath Elijah's stern exterior lay stories darker than the family was allowed to hear. Every time he walked past the oak, he felt the weight of those unspoken tales pressing down on him like the shadow of its branches. When Elijah's health began to fail, the oak seemed to loom even larger in Marcus's thoughts. The old man would sit beneath it less often, too weak to walk across the yard, but he still watched it through the kitchen window. Sometimes Marcus caught him staring, eyes fixed on the tree as if trying to memorize it before he was gone. Other times he thought he saw a flicker of sadness in those eyes, as if Elijah knew the secret would die with him. But Elijah said nothing. He left no instructions, no explanations, only silence. In the final weeks, when the tumor in his spine made every movement agony, Elijah was confined to bed. Marcus visited him often, sitting by his side in the dim light of the bedroom where the curtains stayed drawn. He wanted to ask about the oak, wanted to finally break the silence. But each time the question rose in his throat, the sight of his grandfather's pain stole the words away. He told himself there would be time later, after a good day, after the pain eased. But that day never came. When Elijah passed, the house felt emptier than Marcus had ever known. Neighbors filled the yard for the funeral, speaking in hushed tones about the man they had respected and feared. Some glanced toward the oak, as though expecting it to wither now that its guardian was gone. But the tree stood unshaken, its branches swaying gently in the breeze, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Marcus stood at the graveside, holding his daughter's hand, and when he looked back at the tree, he felt the chill run through him. For the first time, the oak seemed to be looking back at him. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself lingering near the back window, staring out at the tree just as his grandfather once had. The house was his now and the land, and with them came the unanswered questions that Elijah had taken to the grave. The oak stood in the middle of it all, silent but imposing, daring him to wonder. and though he tried to turn his mind to the practical matters of the property, the thought clung to him. Whatever had bound his grandfather to that tree was now his burden to carry. The memory of Elijah's voice that summer day echoed in him. Get away from there. Even now, long after his grandfather was gone, Marcus felt the command resonate. But there was no one left to enforce it. The tree was his to do with as he pleased. And though he told himself he would leave it be, deep down he knew the time would come when curiosity would win. The oak was not finished with him. The weeks after Elijah's funeral were heavy with silence, the kind that crept into every room of the old house and lingered there, pressing down on Marcus like an invisible weight. The neighbors, who had crowded into the yard for the service, slowly stopped coming by with their condolences. The whispers about the stern veteran faded into the background hum of daily gossip, and the town returned to its rhythm. But inside the Johnson house, nothing felt normal. Marcus found himself drifting from room to room, not searching for anything in particular, only feeling the echoes of his grandfather in the creak of the floorboards, the faint smell of tobacco that clung stubbornly to the curtains, the sight of the empty chair on the porch. Elijah had died without leaving behind much in the way of instructions. There was no detailed will, only a few lines written in shaky script on a folded sheet of paper tucked into a Bible. It left the house, the land, and everything on it to Marcus with one simple request: take care of the place. No explanation, no mention of the oak that stood watch in the backyard. Marcus stared at those words more than once, wondering if his grandfather had meant them literally or if there was some unspoken message hidden beneath them. Moving into the old house felt strange at first, like stepping into a memory that did not belong to him. He brought his wife, Lillian, and their young daughter, Rose, with him, determined to make it a home again. They had been living in a cramped apartment in the city, surrounded by noise and concrete, and at first the thought of space, fresh air, and a yard seemed like a blessing. But as boxes were unpacked and furniture was rearranged, the shadows of the past refused to loosen their hold. Every picture frame on the walls, every item left behind on the shelves spoke of Elijah's life, not Marcus's. Lillian tried to brighten the place with her usual energy, opening windows to let the sun in, planting flowers along the walkway, rearranging the old furniture into something that felt less oppressive. She spoke often about plans for the future, how they could renovate the back porch, how Rose would love a swing set in the yard, how they might even add a small garden where she could grow vegetables. Marcus nodded and agreed, but his eyes always wandered back to the oak. Its shadow seemed to stretch farther than before, as though it resisted every effort at change. Nights were the hardest. When the house was quiet and Rose had been put to bed, Marcus would sit at the kitchen table with a glass of water, staring out the window toward the backyard. He remembered Elijah sitting there, the intensity in his eyes fixed on that same view. Now the responsibility was his, and though he wanted to dismiss the unease as superstition, it stayed with him. The oak was not just a tree, and he could not pretend otherwise. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus began to notice the practical problems the oak created. Its roots had grown thick and sprawling, pushing up against the foundation of the old shed where Elijah once kept his tools. The branches stretched wide over the yard, dropping acorns and leaves in heavy clusters that clogged the gutters and littered the grass. Some of the bark had grown brittle, and during storms he worried one of the great limbs might snap and crash onto the house. The tree was a hazard, plain and simple. He mentioned this once to Lillian as they stood in the yard one afternoon, watching Rose chase a butterfly through the grass. Lillian shielded her eyes from the sun and followed his gaze to the towering oak. "That tree is beautiful," she said. "It makes the yard feel alive. It's like it's been here forever." "It's been here longer than me, that's for sure," Marcus replied, his tone heavy, "but it's starting to cause problems. Look at the shed. The foundation is cracking, and you know how much work it takes to clean up after every storm." Lillian turned to him, her expression softening. "You've been thinking about cutting it down, haven't you?" Marcus hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. I keep remembering how Grandpa never let anyone near it. It feels wrong even to say it out loud. But he's gone now, and we have to live here. Rose has to grow up here. I want this place to be safe for her." For a moment, Lillian said nothing. She reached down to smooth her daughter's hair as the little girl laughed and ran past them. "Safe is important," she admitted quietly, "but so is letting go. Your grandfather was a hard man, Marcus. He carried things from the past that he never wanted to share. Maybe holding on to that tree the way he did was just part of it. Maybe it's not about the tree at all. Maybe it's about him not being able to move on." Her words struck Marcus more deeply than he expected. He thought of the countless evenings when Elijah sat in his chair beneath the oak, staring at nothing, lost in memories. He thought of the sharpness in his voice when he forbade anyone from touching it. Was it protection, or was it fear? He did not know, and he realized he never would. Yet the idea of removing the oak grew stronger each day. It wasn't just about safety or space. It was about reclaiming the land, making it their own. Marcus loved his grandfather, but he was tired of living in his shadow. He wanted Rose to have a childhood filled with laughter, not fear of a tree that loomed over her every step. He wanted his wife to have the garden she dreamed of. He wanted to breathe without feeling the past pressing down on him from the branches above. The turning point came late one night after a storm. Rain had hammered the house for hours, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows. Marcus had lain awake, listening to the groaning of the old oak as its limbs strained against the gusts. When morning came, he stepped outside and saw one of the branches, thick as a man's torso, had cracked and hung dangerously low over the roof of the shed. The sight filled him with dread, but also with clarity. The tree had to go. When he told Lillian of his decision, she nodded slowly. "If you're sure," she said, though there was still sadness in her voice. Rose, too young to understand, only clapped her hands at the idea of having more space to play. Marcus tried to smile for her sake, but inside he felt the weight of his grandfather's stare, as though Elijah himself were standing there, silently disapproving. That evening, Marcus stood at the window, looking out at the oak as the setting sun painted its bark in hues of gold and shadow. He thought about the stories the neighbors told about the fear in his grandfather's eyes the day he had pulled him away from it. He thought about the words written in the Bible, "Take care of the place." Perhaps Elijah had meant to protect the tree. Or perhaps he had meant something else entirely. Marcus would never know. But one thing was certain now. The oak's time was coming to an end. The air in the house felt heavy that night, and Marcus struggled to sleep. He dreamed of roots twisting through the soil, wrapping themselves around secrets too old to name. He dreamed of his grandfather's voice echoing in the dark. Get away from there. When he woke, drenched in sweat, he sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to himself, "It has to be done." By morning, he was resolved. He would call the logging company. The oak, which had ruled over his family's land for generations, would soon fall. And whatever it had been guarding all these years Whatever had kept Elijah's eyes fixed on it until his dying day, Marcus was about to uncover whether he was ready or not. The morning he made the call to the logging company, Marcus felt as though he were crossing an invisible line. His hand lingered over the phone longer than it should have, as if Elijah's voice might rise from the grave and stop him. But there was no voice, no hand on his shoulder, only silence and the soft hum of the house around him. When the man on the other end answered, Marcus explained what he needed: an old oak, massive and heavy, removed from his property. The man asked a few questions about size and access, then promised to send a crew in a few days. Marcus hung up and stood by the kitchen window, staring at the tree that loomed in the yard. Its branches stretched wide, casting their shadows across the ground as though embracing everything within their reach. For the first time, Marcus saw it not just as a hazard, but as a giant that had guarded his family's secrets longer than he had been alive. Soon, that giant would fall. The neighbors were quick to notice when the truck pulled into the yard. In a town as small as theirs, where little went unnoticed, it was no surprise that faces appeared in windows and figures leaned against the porches to watch. The crew that stepped out of the truck looked like men who had spent their lives wrestling with timber. Broad-shouldered, their shirts worn and stained, their boots heavy with dust. They surveyed the oak with practiced eyes, nodding at its size, whistling low at the width of its trunk. One of them muttered that it was the biggest they'd seen in months. Marcus felt their gazes turn briefly toward him, measuring him as if to say, "Are you sure you want this done?" He nodded firmly, though the weight in his chest told another story. Rose ran in circles around the yard, laughing, too young to understand what was about to happen. Lillian stood with her arms folded, watching the men prepare their tools. She did not speak, but Marcus knew what she was thinking. This was not just about clearing space. It was about breaking a bond his grandfather had guarded with his life. He caught her eye, and for a moment they held each other's gaze. Then she turned back to Rose, calling her closer, away from the danger. The first cut into the bark echoed through the yard like a gunshot. Marcus flinched, and a hush fell over the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered at the fence to watch. The chainsaw roared, biting deep into the ancient wood, spitting sawdust into the air like a shower of golden dust. The oak groaned under the assault, its massive branches trembling. To Marcus, it sounded almost alive, as if the tree itself resisted the intrusion. He remembered the way storms had lashed against it, how year after year it had stood against the wind. It had defied lightning, resisted rot, survived drought. But it could not resist the steel teeth of the saw. Hours passed as the men worked, cutting and carving, placing ropes around the trunk, measuring the fall so it would not crush the shed or the house. The sound of metal against wood, the scent of fresh-cut oak, filled the air. At times, Marcus had to turn away, his stomach twisting with a guilt he could not shake. He thought of Elijah sitting under those branches, whispering to the night, guarding the tree like a sentinel. He thought of the command that had followed him since childhood. Get away from there. Now the command was broken. The tree was being torn apart piece by piece, and Elijah's voice was powerless to stop it. When the final cut was made, the men shouted warnings, their voices sharp and commanding. Ropes strained, the ground seemed to shudder, and the oak let out a final groan as though mourning its own end. Then, with a crash that shook the earth, it toppled. Branches splintered, birds scattered into the sky, and dust rose in a cloud that hung over the yard. Rose clapped her hands at the noise, not understanding the weight of what she had witnessed. Lillian pulled her close, shielding her from flying debris. Marcus stood frozen, his chest tight, staring at the fallen giant that lay across the ground like a slain beast. For a moment, he almost expected to hear Elijah's footsteps, to feel his hand on his shoulder, demanding an explanation. But there was only silence. The men moved quickly, cutting away limbs, trimming the massive trunk into sections that could be hauled away. The neighbors drifted back to their own homes, shaking their heads, whispering among themselves. Some seemed relieved, others disapproving. Marcus did not care what they thought. His eyes were fixed on the ground where the tree had once stood. The stump jutted from the earth like a broken tooth, its rings exposed to the sun for the first time in centuries. Sawdust clung to the roots that had been ripped from the soil, twisting and curling like fingers grasping at something below. It was then that Marcus noticed a glint of black among the roots. At first, he thought it was a stone, or perhaps a shadow, but as he stepped closer, the color sharpened against the brown earth. Something unnatural, something hidden. His heart quickened. He looked around, but the workers were busy with their saws, not paying attention. He crouched down, brushing soil away with his hands. The blackness revealed itself slowly, a torn edge of plastic, dull and worn, but still intact. It was a bag. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He dug more eagerly now, his fingers clawing at the dirt until he uncovered the shape fully. It was a large plastic sack, tied shut with an old length of cord. The bag was filthy, caked with soil, but it was clear it had been buried intentionally. His mind raced. This was what Elijah had been protecting. This was why no one had been allowed near the oak. He sat back on his heels, his chest pounding, staring at the thing that had slumbered beneath their feet all those years. One of the workers noticed and called out, asking if everything was all right. Marcus waved him off quickly, saying he just wanted to check the roots. The man shrugged and returned to his task. Lillian, however, had seen. She came closer, her eyes narrowing as she saw the bag. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice tight with unease. "What's that?" He shook his head, unable to answer. He tugged at the cord that bound the sack, but the knot was stiff with age, the plastic stiff. At last it gave way, and he pulled the opening apart. The smell hit him first, earthy, metallic, the scent of time sealed away. He forced himself to look inside. In the shadows of the bag, shapes emerged. Metal glinted, dark and cold. His hand trembled as he reached inside and pulled free the first object, a revolver, old but unmistakably deadly. Its surface was speckled with rust, but it remained intact, heavy in his palm. He set it aside quickly, his pulse racing, and reached again. Bullets, tarnished but whole. A knife with a worn handle, and deeper still, papers, photographs, bundles of letters tied together with string. At the very bottom, wrapped in a separate cloth, something darker, a fragment of fabric stained deep with old blood. Marcus jerked his hand back, his stomach lurching. He stared at the cloth, unable to breathe. Behind him, Lillian gasped and covered her mouth. Rose, thankfully, had wandered to the far side of the yard, oblivious to what her parents had uncovered. Marcus pulled the sack closer, examining the contents with dread. Metals glimmered faintly in the dim light, alongside military dog tags. A journal, its leather cover cracked, lay pressed against the side. This was no random collection. This was deliberate, preserved, hidden. He sat back again, his mind reeling. Elijah had buried this, kept it secret, guarded it with his life. The oak had not just been a tree, it had been a sentinel over the past, shielding a truth Elijah had never wanted revealed. And now, with the tree gone, the secret had surfaced, demanding to be faced. The workers still labored, unaware of what had been unearthed. Lillian knelt beside Marcus, her eyes wide, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this, Marcus? Why would he keep this here?" Marcus could not answer. His throat was dry, his thoughts a storm. He looked at the revolver, at the blood-stained cloth, at the journal that might contain answers. Then he looked up at the sky, where the branches of the oak had once spread wide. The sun beat down on him, unfiltered, unhidden. There was no more shade, no more protection. The secret was his now, and there was no going back. The air around Marcus seemed thicker as he sat on the churned soil beside the stump, the black plastic sack spread open before him like a wound. The steady hum of chainsaws and the rhythmic crack of axes from the workers clearing the branches sounded distant now, muffled beneath the rush of blood in his ears. He could barely hear Lillian's voice calling his name, could hardly feel the sweat rolling down his temples. All his senses were focused on the contents of the bag, on the terrible weight of the things his grandfather had hidden under the roots of the oak. The revolver lay at his feet, its dull steel reflecting sunlight like the eye of something long dead but not forgotten. Next to it rested a small box of ammunition, the brass shells corroded but still intact, each one a reminder that these were not relics for display, but tools once meant to kill. The knife, with its cracked wooden handle, had been sharpened so many times its edge was jagged, a scarred weapon that seemed to have its own history. Marcus dared not touch it again. Beside the weapons were the papers, bound in packets with twine that had frayed to near breaking. He lifted one bundle carefully, his fingers brushing away the dirt. Letters, dozens of them, written in Elijah's careful, slanted script. Some were folded neatly, others crumpled as though written in haste. He opened the first one he touched and tried to read, but the ink had bled in places, the words smudged and blurred by time and soil. Still, enough was clear to make his stomach twist. The letter spoke of meetings held in secret, of marches that turned violent, of men taken in the night and beaten for daring to demand equality. The tone was urgent, fearful, yet determined. It was not the voice of the calm, stern grandfather Marcus remembered. It was the voice of a young man living in the midst of struggle, convinced that everything he loved could be destroyed in an instant. Photographs spilled out next, their edges curling, their black and white images grainy but unmistakable. Marcus held one up and felt a shiver crawl down his spine. In the picture, Elijah stood among a group of men and women holding signs, their faces solemn, their eyes fierce with conviction. Some of them Marcus recognized from stories of the civil rights movement, local figures who had been arrested, who had marched through towns where hatred lined the sidewalks. Elijah had never spoken of being there, never admitted that he had stood on the front lines. Yet here was the proof in Marcus's hands, undeniable. But not all the photographs showed protests and raised signs. Some were darker, blurred images taken in shadows. One showed a man lying in the dirt, his face swollen, his shirt torn and stained. Another captured the outline of police cars at night, their lights barely visible. Marcus's throat tightened as he shuffled through them, each picture revealing another layer of violence, of fear, of memories Elijah had buried beneath the oak. And then there was the fragment of fabric, wrapped separately in a piece of cloth that had long since yellowed with age. It bore a dark stain that time had not erased. Marcus recoiled when he touched it, his fingers trembling. The stain was dried blood, unmistakable even after decades. His chest constricted as he stared at it, unable to look away. Why would Elijah have kept this? Why preserve such a thing and hide it in the earth? The question gnawed at him with every heartbeat. Lillian stood behind him, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other clutching his shoulder. She whispered, "Marcus, you have to stop. This isn't something we should be touching. Call the police. Let them handle it." But Marcus couldn't stop. His hand reached for the leather-bound journal buried at the bottom of the bag. He pulled it free, the cover cracked and stiff, the pages swollen from years underground. He opened it, and the smell of earth and old ink rose to meet him. The handwriting was Elijah's, the same strong script from the letters, but these words were personal, raw. The first page alone sent chills down Marcus's spine. It spoke of nights spent running through back streets, hiding from men in uniforms who carried clubs and rifles. It spoke of friends beaten until they could not walk, of names carved into memory with pain. But woven into the stories of struggle were darker entries, ones Elijah had never spoken aloud. One passage described a night of confrontation, when Elijah and others had armed themselves, determined to defend their community. The revolver, the bullets, the knife, they were not keepsakes, but instruments from that night. The words trailed into anger, then grief, then something Marcus could not name. His hands trembled as he flipped further until he reached an entry that stopped him cold. It told of a police officer known in town for his brutality, a man whose name Marcus dimly recalled hearing in hushed tones when he was young. The journal described how that man had disappeared after one particularly violent clash. The entry did not say outright what had happened, but between the lines, Marcus could read the truth. Something had been done. Something that left a stain not only on cloth but on Elijah's soul. Marcus closed the journal quickly, his breath shallow. The world around him tilted, the stump, the soil, the sky above him spinning. His grandfather had been a man of dignity, a man who spoke few words but carried himself with pride. To discover this hidden life, this secret past filled with violence and fear, was like watching the foundation of his childhood crumble beneath him. He wanted to deny it, to believe it was someone else's handwriting, someone else's bag. But deep inside, he knew. The stern gaze, the endless silence, the way Elijah had guarded the oak with his life, it all made sense now. One of the workers approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Everything all right over here?" he asked, his eyes flicking curiously to the ground where Marcus sat. Marcus hastily pushed the journal back into the bag, covering the revolver with soil. He forced a smile, though his face felt stiff. "Yeah," he said hoarsely, "just checking the roots. Go on with your work." The man shrugged and returned to the others, the roar of chainsaws rising once more. When they were gone again, Marcus let out a long, shaky breath. Lillian knelt beside him, her eyes searching his. "What do we do, Marcus?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This isn't just old papers, it's evidence. It's dangerous. If the police see this, they'll dig into everything. Do you want them to tear apart your grandfather's name? Our family's name?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked at the bag, at the things his grandfather had buried and protected with such desperation. He thought of the years Elijah had spent sitting beneath the oak, watching, guarding, as if afraid someone would discover what lay beneath. Now, Marcus was the one sitting here, the bag open, the secret alive again. His pulse hammered as he realized he was standing at a crossroads. He closed the bag gently, tying the cord back into place. His hands were steady now, though his mind churned. "We don't decide tonight," he whispered to Lillian. "Not until I've read it all. Not until I understand what he was hiding. I need to know who he really was." The sky had begun to darken by the time the workers finished clearing the last of the fallen branches. They packed their tools, gave brief waves, and drove off, leaving Marcus and his family alone in the yard. The stump loomed in the fading light, jagged and raw, a scar on the earth. The bag lay at Marcus's feet, heavy with the weight of history, with the burden of truth. He lifted it carefully, carried it into the house, and set it down on the kitchen table. Rose tugged at his leg, asking when dinner would be ready, her innocent voice cutting through the haze of his thoughts. Marcus smiled weakly at her, stroking her hair, but his eyes drifted back to the bag. That night, after Rose was asleep and Lillian sat silently on the couch, Marcus opened the journal again. The words swam before his eyes, pulling him deeper into a past that had been buried for decades. Every line he read, every photograph he studied, drew him further into Elijah's world. It was not just the story of his grandfather, but of a whole generation who had lived in fear and fought back in ways that blurred the line between justice and vengeance. And yet, as he turned the pages, one thought refused to leave him. The oak had fallen, but what it had guarded was only beginning to rise. Whatever secrets Elijah had hoped would die with him were alive now in Marcus's hands. And sooner or later, they would demand to be faced. The journal lay open on the table long into the night, its cracked leather cover casting a shadow under the dim kitchen light. Marcus turned the pages slowly, his fingertips brushing over the words as though touching them might somehow connect him to the man who had written them. Outside, the yard was hushed, the stump of the oak looming like a sentinel in the moonlight. The house creaked with the usual whispers of old wood, but Marcus hardly noticed. His mind was buried in the fragile pages, in the story that unfolded line by line, a story his grandfather had taken pains to conceal beneath the roots of that tree. The entries began with descriptions of days long past, the turbulent years when Elijah had been a young man trying to find his place in a country that seemed to deny him one at every turn. Marcus read about the marches through narrow southern streets where voices rose in unison, demanding justice, while jeers and threats rained down from sidewalks lined with hatred. The journal described the tension that lingered in every breath, the knowledge that at any moment a protest could turn into chaos, that a peaceful crowd could be scattered by clubs, dogs, or bullets. Elijah had written not with the detachment of someone recording history, but with the urgency of a man fighting to survive each day. Marcus had grown up hearing of the civil rights movement in school, names of great leaders spoken with reverence, dates memorized for exams. But reading Elijah's words was different. It was no longer history in a textbook. It was his blood, his fear, his hope. Marcus could feel the desperation in the ink, could sense the determination that had driven Elijah and his companions to risk everything. Yet the journal did not paint Elijah as a flawless hero, far from it. In the spaces between words, in the angry strokes of the pen, Marcus saw a man wrestling with rage, with doubt, with the temptation to meet violence with violence. The letters, tied in bundles, echoed the same struggle. Some were addressed to men and women Marcus had never heard of, comrades in the fight who wrote in hurried tones about meetings in secret basements, about safe houses and betrayals, about the constant fear of infiltration by informants. One letter, worn thin at the creases, spoke of a night when Elijah and others had armed themselves to protect their families after repeated attacks. The writer described the look in Elijah's eyes, how the weight of the pistol in his hand had seemed to change him, how a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Marcus's throat tightened as he read, the words pressing into him with the force of truth he was not ready for. The photographs told their own story. Some showed crowds marching with banners held high, faces determined against the backdrop of snarling police dogs and raised batons. Others were quieter, intimate snapshots of men and women gathered in kitchens, planning strategy over cups of coffee, their expressions weary but resolute. And then there were the darker ones, the ones Marcus found himself staring at longest, trying to understand. One, grainy and blurred, captured a man sprawled on the ground, blood darkening his shirt. Another showed Elijah standing in the shadows of a street at night, his jaw tight, his eyes hard, a revolver faintly visible in his hand. Marcus felt a coldness seep into him as he turned those photographs over, unable to reconcile them with the grandfather who had taught him how to fish, who had sat silently on the porch as the sun set, who had told him to be strong but never cruel. The blood-stained cloth haunted him most of all. Its presence was a riddle without an answer, a fragment of some violent moment preserved like a relic. He could not look at it without imagining whose blood it had been, what night of fury or fear had left it soaked. He turned back to the journal again and again, hoping for a line that explained it, a confession or even a hint. And though Elijah's words circled the memory, describing a confrontation with a policeman known for brutality, they never admitted outright what had happened. It was as if Elijah had written enough to ease his burden, but not enough to condemn himself. Marcus sat back in his chair, his hands trembling, his eyes burning from the strain. Lillian appeared in the doorway, her face pale. She had been watching him for hours, letting him pore over the fragments of Elijah's hidden life. Now she stepped closer, resting her hand on his shoulder. "You see why I said we should call someone?" she whispered. "This isn't just family history, Marcus. This is dangerous. If anyone else sees this, it could destroy everything." But Marcus shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice low. "It's more than that. It's who he was. All my life I thought Grandpa was just a hard man, a quiet man. But he was fighting battles I never knew about. He carried this weight, and he never let it go. How could he? Look at it, Lillian. He buried it because he couldn't live with it in the open. But now it's here, and it's mine to face." She crouched beside him, her eyes searching his. And what if facing it means destroying his memory? What if people see this, and all they remember is the violence, not the fight for justice? Do you want Rose to grow up hearing whispers that her great-grandfather was a killer? Marcus looked at the journal, at the photographs scattered across the table, at the revolver still glinting faintly in the dim light. He felt the enormity of the choice pressing down on him. To bury the truth again would mean silence, the same silence Elijah had chosen. To reveal it could mean shattering the legacy of a man the town respected, even feared. But the truth was out now, and pretending it wasn't would not make it disappear. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the stump in the moonlight. The oak was gone, but its shadow still seemed to stretch across the yard, a phantom reminder of the burden he had inherited. He remembered Elijah's eyes watching that tree every evening, the way his voice had trembled with anger the day Marcus tried to climb it as a boy. Now he understood. It wasn't the tree Elijah feared. It was what lay beneath it, what it guarded. And now that secret had risen into the light, demanding to be reckoned with. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes. Behind him, the bag still sat on the table, heavy with the weight of the past. He could almost hear Elijah's voice again, though it sounded different now. Not a command, but a plea. Take care of the place. Was this what his grandfather had meant? To protect not just the land, but the story buried in it? Or had those words been a warning, begging him to leave the secret undisturbed? Sleep did not come easily that night. When it did, it brought dreams of men running through dark alleys, of shouts and gunshots, of Elijah's face younger, harder, twisted by fear and fury. Marcus woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the echo of those dreams lingering in his chest. He rose quietly so as not to wake Lillian or Rose, and returned to the table, lighting a lamp to read further. The pages revealed more names, more nights of secrecy, more whispered plans that never made it into the history books. Elijah had lived a life of two halves. The man the town saw, the man his family knew, and the man who had carried a revolver in the shadows, who had stood in alleys with blood on his hands and determination in his heart. Marcus read until the sky outside turned pale, until the weight of the past pressed on him so heavily he could hardly breathe. By the time Lillian entered the kitchen with Rose in her arms, Marcus was still seated at the table, the journal open, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He looked at his wife and child and felt the enormity of the burden again. The truth could not stay hidden forever. The oak was gone, and with it the shield that had kept this story buried. Now the responsibility rested with him. Whether to protect his grandfather's memory or expose it, whether to remain silent or speak, the choice was his. But whatever he decided, he knew one thing with certainty. Elijah's past was no longer just his. It belonged to Marcus now, and it demanded to be faced. Morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, but Marcus hardly noticed. The journal lay open before him, its pages littered with notes in his grandfather's hand, and around it were spread the photographs and letters he had unearthed from the black plastic bag. The revolver and the knife remained wrapped in cloth, pushed to one side, but their presence weighed on the air like ghosts. He sat with his elbows on the table, his head in his hands, staring down at the fragments of Elijah's hidden life, as though sheer concentration could force them to make sense. Yet, the more he read, the deeper the contradictions became. He had wanted to believe his grandfather was a man of quiet dignity, a veteran who had returned from war and chosen a life of silence and discipline. But the Elijah on these pages was different. Angry, driven, conflicted. There was courage in his words, yes, the kind of courage that stood tall against oppression, but there was also rage and the willingness to do things that lived in the shadows of morality. The letters from comrades hinted at nights when Elijah had carried the revolver tucked beneath his coat, when the knife at his side was not for show but for survival. And then there was the blood-stained cloth, still folded carefully, still holding the evidence of a night Marcus could only imagine. The weight of it pressed into him until he could hardly breathe. Lillian entered quietly, setting a hand on his shoulder. She said nothing at first, only stood there, her eyes flicking over the mess of papers and photographs. Finally, she whispered, "You were up all night again." Marcus nodded but didn't look at her. "I had to keep reading. I thought maybe I'd find something that explained it all, something that told me why he kept these things. But every page just makes it worse. He wasn't just part of the movement. He was deeper. He was involved in things no one ever told me about." Lillian sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "And now, you know. But the question is, what are you going to do with it?" The question lingered in the air, and Marcus felt it sink into him. What was he going to do? If he took the bag to the police, they would investigate. They would examine the weapons, the photographs, the letters. They might tie his grandfather to things that had long been buried. They might smear his name, drag his memory through the mud. But if he hid it again, if he put the bag back beneath the soil or burned its contents, he would be complicit in the silence, repeating the same choice Elijah had made. The burden would not vanish. It would merely shift onto his shoulders, and one day Rose might stumble into the same truth unprepared. The rest of that day, he moved through the house like a man divided. He played with Rose in the yard, but his laughter sounded hollow even to himself. He helped Lillian prepare dinner, but his mind wandered back to the bag on the table. At night, when he lay in bed beside his wife, he stared at the ceiling long after she had drifted off to sleep, replaying Elijah's words in the journal, hearing again and again that silent plea, "Take care of the place." Did that mean keeping the secret safe, or did it mean finally setting it free? As the days passed, the whispers in town began. The neighbors had seen the loggers take down the oak. They had seen Marcus digging among the roots. They didn't know what he had found, but in a place where stories traveled faster than truth, it didn't matter. People muttered that Elijah had hidden something, that his grandson had uncovered it. When Marcus walked down Main Street to buy supplies, he felt their eyes on him, their conversations breaking off as he passed. He carried the weight of the bag even when it was not in his hands. One evening, Lillian confronted him more directly. "Marcus, this can't go on. You've been brooding for days, and the neighbors are talking. They know something's up. If you don't act, someone else will. What happens if they come asking questions and you have no answer?" He stared at her, weary and raw. "And what do you want me to say, Lillian? That I found proof my grandfather was ready to kill? That maybe he did kill? That he hid it under the tree we played beside as kids? That he built his life around a secret so heavy he carried it to his grave? Do you want me to drag his name through the dirt after he spent his life building it? I want you to protect our family," she said firmly, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. "I want Rose to grow up without this hanging over her. If you try to keep it hidden, it will come out eventually. Better it comes from you than from someone else." Her words struck him hard, and he turned away, pacing the room. He wanted to protect his grandfather's memory, but he also wanted to protect his daughter's future. The two desires clashed inside him, tearing him apart. Elijah's silence had been his choice, but now Marcus had no such luxury. The secret was no longer buried. It was sitting in his kitchen, demanding judgment. That night, Marcus sat alone by the stump of the oak, the journal in his lap. The air was cool, the crickets loud in the grass. He stared at the rings of the stump, each one a year of life the tree had carried, and thought of the decades Elijah had spent guarding what lay beneath it. The oak had been more than wood and leaves. It had been a monument to silence, to secrets, to a choice Elijah had made long ago. And now it was gone, and the choice lay with him. He opened the journal again, flipping to the last entry. Elijah's handwriting was weaker here, the letters uneven, as though his hand had trembled. The words were brief but heavy. Some things a man does he cannot undo, some truths he cannot bear to tell, but someone must carry them, even if only to know they exist. I chose silence. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the tree was never strong enough to hold it. Marcus read those words again and again until they blurred on the page. The decision crystallized slowly, like dawn breaking through darkness. He could not bury the truth again, not after reading these words, not after understanding what Elijah had carried. To silence it would be to betray not only his grandfather but himself. It would mean condemning Rose to inherit the same shadow one day. The truth was ugly, but it was still truth, and it had to be faced. The next morning, Marcus told Lillian his decision. His voice was steady, though his chest felt tight. "I'm going to the police," he said. "They deserve to know what I found, and Rose deserves to grow up without this hanging over her head." Lillian looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. There was fear in her eyes, but also relief. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then we'll do it together," she said softly. Marcus looked past her to the window, where the stump stood in the yard, bathed in early light. The oak was gone, but the weight of what it had hidden remained. Soon the world would know, and when it did, the shadow that had ruled his family for generations would finally be broken, even if it meant tearing open wounds that had never healed. The decision weighed heavily on Marcus, even as it gave him a strange sense of release. For days he had walked the house like a man possessed, torn between silence and truth, but now that he had chosen, a quiet certainty settled over him. The morning he picked up the phone to call the police, he half expected his hand to tremble, but it did not. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he explained that he had found items buried on his property that might require investigation. He gave no details over the line, only his name, his address, and the fact that it was urgent. When he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table beside the black plastic bag, his eyes fixed on it, waiting for the inevitable knock. It came sooner than he expected. 2 patrol cars pulled up in the yard just after noon, the sound of gravel crunching beneath their tires carrying through the house like a summons. Lillian stood at the sink, watching through the window with a face drawn tight, while Rose played obliviously with her dolls in the living room. Marcus stepped outside before the officers could knock, greeting them with a nod that felt heavy with resignation. They introduced themselves, their tones polite but firm, and asked if he was the one who had made the call. When he confirmed, they followed him inside. The sight of the bag on the table changed the air instantly. Their postures stiffened, their eyes narrowing with the wary recognition of men who had seen things hidden for reasons no one wanted to explain. Marcus stepped back as one of them opened the sack, pulling out the revolver, the knife, the bundles of letters. The photographs were spread across the table, the metals glinting faintly under the overhead light. The officer handling the items wore gloves, his movements precise, his face unreadable. When he reached the blood-stained cloth, his expression flickered, but he said nothing. He simply folded it carefully and placed it into a separate evidence bag. Questions came, as Marcus knew they would. Where had he found these things? How long had they been buried? Had his grandfather ever spoken about them? Marcus answered as best he could, his voice steady but low. He told them about the oak, about Elijah's obsession with it, about the way he had never allowed anyone near it. He told them how the tree had been cut down, how the roots had exposed the sack. He did not embellish, did not speculate, though his mind screamed with the questions he dared not voice. The officers listened, jotting notes, occasionally exchanging glances that told Marcus they understood the gravity of what they were uncovering. When they finally gathered the items into boxes and prepared to leave, one of the officers placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. His voice was softer than before, almost kind. "This isn't easy, son. What you did, bringing this forward, it was the right thing. Not everyone would have had the courage." Marcus nodded, though the words gave him no comfort. Right or not, it felt like betrayal. As the patrol cars pulled away, carrying the secrets of Elijah Johnson into official hands, Marcus stood in the yard staring at the empty space they left behind. Lillian came to his side, slipping her hand into his, and together they looked at the stump of the oak. The yard was quiet except for the sound of Rose laughing in the distance, chasing a butterfly across the grass. The world had not ended, yet something irreversible had happened. The truth, once buried, was now free, and whatever followed was beyond their control. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with rumor. Word spread quickly that the Johnson family had uncovered something buried beneath the old oak. Some said it was weapons from Elijah's time in the war. Others claimed it was evidence from darker deeds. Old stories resurfaced about the policemen who had disappeared, about nights of violence whispered in kitchens but never spoken aloud in public. Elijah's name, once carried with a mix of fear and respect, now hung heavy with suspicion. Marcus heard the whispers when he walked through town, saw the looks cast his way, but he held his head high. Whatever the truth was, it was no longer his to hide. The police came back more than once, asking more questions, showing him photographs from their archives, comparing them with the ones he had found. They wanted details, names, connections. Marcus answered what he could, but much of it remained a mystery even to him. Elijah had written enough to hint at the truth, but never enough to confess. It was as though he had wanted the burden shared, but not the condemnation. The investigation unfolded slowly, methodically, but Marcus knew it would not end soon. The past never yielded its secrets quickly. At night, when the house was quiet and Rose asleep, Marcus sat alone with the few items he had kept. He had not given the police everything. The journal remained hidden in a drawer in his study, along with a handful of letters and one photograph of Elijah standing tall among his comrades, eyes fierce with conviction. He told himself he had kept them for Rose, so that one day she might understand the complexity of the man whose blood ran in her veins. The authorities could have their evidence, but the memory belonged to the family. He read the journal again and again, trying to reconcile the man in its pages with the man he had known. Elijah had been both hero and sinner, both protector and aggressor, both silent guardian and haunted soul. The duality tore at Marcus, but it also gave him a strange sense of peace. No man was simple, no life without shadows. His grandfather had carried his secret alone, and now Marcus carried it too, but not in silence. By choosing to speak, he had broken the cycle, even if it left scars on the family name. One evening, Marcus stood in the yard beside the stump. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air was thick with the scent of summer. He rested his hand on the rough surface of the stump, tracing the rings etched into the wood, each one a year of life the oak had endured. He thought of Elijah sitting here, year after year, guarding the secret beneath the roots. The tree was gone now, but its absence was as heavy as its presence had been. Rose came running to him, her small hands clutching a flower she had picked from the edge of the yard. She held it up proudly, her smile wide and unburdened. Marcus knelt to take it, his heart swelling with the weight of generations. He looked at her face, so full of innocence, and felt a quiet resolve take hold. Whatever the world chose to say about Elijah, whatever judgment was passed, he would make sure Rose grew up knowing not only the shadows, but also the light. She would know her great-grandfather had fought for justice, and had stood when standing was dangerous, even if he had faltered in ways he could never admit. That night, after Rose was asleep, Marcus planted a sapling in the yard. It was not an oak, but a maple. slender and fragile, its leaves trembling in the evening breeze. He pressed the soil firmly around its base, his hands dirty, his heart steady. Lillian watched from the porch, silent but understanding. The stump of the old oak loomed nearby, a scar in the earth, but beside it the young tree stood as a promise of something new. Marcus whispered a few words into the quiet air, not sure if they were a prayer or a farewell. The old tree had carried the weight of secrets. The new one would carry hope. As the stars appeared overhead and the night settled around him, Marcus stood back and looked at the sapling. The burden of the past was not gone, but it was no longer hidden. The oak had fallen, the bag had been opened, and the truth had been faced. The shadow that had haunted Elijah for decades no longer ruled the yard. Marcus knew the memory of his grandfather would never be simple, never pure, but it would be honest, and in that honesty he found peace. The house was quiet when he stepped inside, the journal waiting in its drawer, the new tree swaying gently outside. Marcus knew the past would always be with him, but he also knew that the future belonged to Rose, to the laughter of children playing in the yard, to evenings unclouded by secrets. The oak was gone, but its shadow would not define them. A new beginning had been planted in its place, and with it came the possibility of healing, of moving forward without forgetting. If this story shocked you, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video right here for even more unbelievable twists, and check out our other videos packed with stories you won't forget. And don't keep this secret to yourself. Share this video with your friends and see their reaction.